For centuries, historians believed the story of the Greenland Vikings was simple and complete because according to traditional history they arrived in a frozen land, built isolated settlements, struggled against the brutal climate, and then suddenly disappeared without a trace as if the earth itself had swallowed them. But what if this entire narrative is wrong? And what if the truth is far more unsettling than a simple disappearance? Because what if the Greenland Vikings never actually left at all? And what if they were never who we thought they were in the first place? The mystery begins with silence because after the early 15th century, all written records from the Norse settlements in Greenland simply stop, and the last known event is a wedding recorded in 1408, which feels almost disturbingly ordinary considering what comes next, because after that moment there are no letters, no survivors returning to Europe, no final messages describing famine or attack or escape, and for hundreds of years historians tried to fill that silence with theories, as some believed the settlers starved due to climate change during the Little Ice Age, while others argued they were wiped out by conflict or disease, or that they abandoned their homes and sailed back to Iceland or Norway. But none of these explanations ever fully solved the mystery because they all assumed one critical idea that we are only now beginning to question, and that idea is that the Vikings were a clearly defined and isolated people. Modern science has changed that assumption completely because when researchers began analyzing ancient DNA extracted from Viking skeletons across Europe and Greenland, the results revealed something unexpected and deeply unsettling, since many individuals buried as Vikings did not have purely Scandinavian ancestry and instead showed genetic links to Southern Europe, to the British Isles, and even to regions far beyond what we once believed was possible, which means the term Viking was never a strict ethnic identity, but rather a role or a lifestyle or even a temporary cultural label that could include people from different origins. And this realization forces us to rethink everything about the Greenland settlements, because if the Vikings were not a single uniform group, then their disappearance cannot be understood as the extinction of a people, but rather as the transformation of an identity. The Norse settlers arrived in Greenland around the year 985, led by Eric the Red, and they established two main settlements known as the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, and for several centuries they survived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth by farming livestock, trading walrus ivory, and maintaining contact with Europe. And at their peak the population may have reached around 3,000 people, which is small but still significant considering the isolation and the harsh climate. However, over time conditions began to change as temperatures dropped and sea ice increased, making trade routes unreliable and cutting the settlers off from essential supplies, while at the same time their farming methods became less effective in the colder environment, leading to declining food production and increasing pressure on the community. But while the Norse struggled, another group was thriving in the same environment, and that group was the Inuit, who had migrated into Greenland around the same period and who possessed survival techniques perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions, including hunting marine animals, using advanced clothing suited for extreme cold, and maintaining a flexible nomadic lifestyle that allowed them to respond to environmental changes. And for a long time historians believed that the Norse and the Inuit remained largely separate with minimal interaction. But emerging evidence suggests that this separation may not have been as absolute as once thought, because archaeological findings and genetic studies indicate the possibility of contact, exchange, and even limited interbreeding between the groups. And this introduces a radically different explanation for what happened to the Greenland Vikings, because instead of imagining a dramatic end involving starvation or violence, we are forced to consider a quieter and more complex process in which the Norse gradually abandoned their traditional way of life and began to adapt to the realities of the Arctic by learning from or integrating with the Inuit. And if this process occurred even partially, then it would mean that the Vikings did not vanish but instead ceased to exist as a distinct cultural identity. Because identity is not something fixed or permanent, but something that can dissolve when circumstances demand change, and over generations language can disappear, traditions can fade, and people can merge into new social structures until the original identity is no longer recognizable. And from the perspective of history, which relies on labels and records, this looks like disappearance, because once the label Viking is no longer applied, the people themselves effectively vanish from the narrative, even if their descendants continue to exist in a different form. However, there is another layer to this mystery that makes it even more disturbing, because modern genetic studies in Greenland show very little clear evidence of direct Norse ancestry among the current population, which suggests that if integration did occur, it was either extremely limited or overshadowed by other factors such as population collapse or replacement. And this raises the possibility that the Norse settlements experienced multiple overlapping processes, including gradual decline, partial assimilation, and eventual disappearance, leaving behind only faint traces that are difficult to detect. And this uncertainty is what makes the story so compelling because it resists a single clear explanation and instead reveals how fragile human societies can be when faced with environmental change, isolation, and shifting power dynamics. The Greenland Vikings believed they could survive by maintaining the same systems and traditions that had worked for them in Scandinavia and Iceland, but the Arctic demanded something different, and those who could not adapt faced extinction, while those who did adapt may have had to abandon the very identity that defined them. And this brings us back to the central idea that the Vikings were never a fixed people but a temporary condition shaped by culture and circumstance. And once those conditions changed, the identity itself became unsustainable. So when we ask what happened to the Greenland Vikings, we may be asking the wrong question, because we are assuming a clear boundary between existence and disappearance, when in reality the process may have been gradual and invisible. And perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is that nothing dramatic needed to happen at all, because no final battle or catastrophe was required for an entire society to vanish from history. All it took was time, pressure, and the slow erosion of identity until one day there was no longer anyone left who could be called a Viking. And this idea challenges not only our understanding of the past but also our perception of stability in the present, because it suggests that cultures and identities that seem permanent can in fact disappear without warning, not through destruction but through transformation. And in the end, the Greenland Vikings may not be a story about mystery at all, but a story about change, and about how easily something we believe to be solid and enduring can dissolve into something unrecognizable, leaving behind only fragments, questions, and the unsettling realization that history does not always record what truly happened but only what it was able to name.